So just a few words before I start. I'm the chair of the Archives Committee, so I'm in the archives frequently on the weekends. And when we were trying to come up with possible topics for these events, I suggested performing arts because I'd seen a few photos here and there and a few programs, etc. So sure, that was added to the schedule. And then when I actually sat down and started going through to find things for the talk, I have ended up with so much material. You can go ahead and start, Steve. I've ended up with so much material that I've decided that this is part one. I had so many slides that I have had to so far throw away. There are so many that I can't throw away yet, so I'm not sure when this talk will end. I have many stopping points, so I'm going to go for no more than about 40-45 minutes and then just stop, and we'll see where we are, and then we'll pick up again the next time I do this. So the performing arts, just in general, I'll start out with giving you an overview of how things were done here at the seminary in terms of the academics, how they were taught, how it changed through the years, and then I'll go and talk about specific types of performing arts here. To start off with their music, they had voice, solo and choir kinds of instruction. For instrumental, it was really limited to violin, piano, mostly. There was some harp occasionally. They always had a harpist on staff, more or less, but they didn't necessarily offer formal courses that were listed in the catalog. Also, organ was offered pretty much consistently throughout, and then they occasionally had mandolin and guitar, but there were no other musical instruments that were formally listed as being offered at the seminary. In terms of drama, back when the seminary started, drama and acting were kind of bad words, I think, for upper class ladies, and so it was described as elocution. And they had movement classes, they had singing, etc. It covered written plays as well. This eventually was renamed drama later on, but it started out as elocution. And then dance was also offered. They always had it. They always had a teacher, instructor on staff, but they never listed formal courses, so it's not clear what they offered. But towards the end, they offered tap and ballroom classes towards the end. So most of the performing arts, most of the things that were performed here on the seminary on the site were done in the Odeon, and that is all of the programs and brochures and flyers that I could find always listed the Odeon as or I should say Odeon, because that's how it was given in the catalog. In the early years, it was actually written out with parentheses around it, so you would know how to pronounce it properly, the Odeon. This was built in 1901. It seated 500 people. This is a photo from about the 1920s, so before this ballroom was built. And this is another view of it coming across the bridge from the railroad station. Here it is on the side, also before the ballroom was built. And then, whoops, jump through those. And that's it from another side. And then this is a photo after the ballroom was built. The music hall was the connecting link between this ballroom and the Odeon, which of course has since burned down. And they also added a scenery wing. They called it onto the other side. This is really touchy. And this is an interior shot that was given in the 1924 catalog. I'm not sure what the date is, but these are the seats. They had box seats up here in the front and on the sides. And then I found a handwritten drawing of all the seats and the seat numbers, so you can see how it was all laid out inside the Odeon. An important person to mention is Francis Wilson. He was an actor here in Washington, relatively well known at the time, and at some point he donated his entire theatrical wardrobe to the drama department. and it's been described, I knew I was going to forget this, hang on. It's been described that he gave the entire theatrical wardrobe. The clothing filled many chests, and Miss Charlotte Priest usually overlooked the costumes, and an outfit for any play was always forthcoming from these chests, be it Shakespeare or Barry, as in J.M., Peter Pan. He became connected to the seminary because he was a friend of DeWitt Miller, and DeWitt Miller was the one who was the Chautauqua speaker who donated the money in his private library to build the Miller Library, which is the green building that's across the street over here. A playbill from one of the many scrapbooks we have in the archives, and this is a play that he was famous for, The Bachelor's Baby, in 1910. Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about academic coursework here. This is sort of the facts and figures part of the talk. So early on, it was elocution, consisted of 11 courses that were offered that included the Delsarte movement methods and singing courses, and I'll talk about Delsarte in a minute. Then they added dramatic arts in the 20s. They were getting a little bit more open to the idea of acting and theater. But they only offered 8 courses. And then in the 39-40, it was just named Dramatic Arts, 8 courses, including at that point 1 radio and broadcasting course. So obviously moving along with the times. In music, they had voice and instrumental, 5 courses in the 1911, 4 in 24, and 3 in 39. And these were just formal courses. For instrumental, they offered piano, organ, violin pretty much every time. In addition, orchestra would pop in and out of the catalog listings, and music theory got added on pretty early and also was consistent throughout. You can see the piano courses kind of dropped in number. Organ was always 2. Violin was pretty much the same, 3 or 4. And this was the only year I could find, or one of the few years I could find harp actually listed as a course. And then the theory courses went from 1 or 2 early on to 3, 6, and then they kind of ended up at 4. And this was pretty consistent across the board. There were very little changes, or very few changes to this kind of schedule at the seminary. They offered degrees in music and literature. It was a combined degree. Elocution and literature in this period. This music literature degree kind of disappeared in the early 30s, and it just became music and dramatic art were the final degrees. But it was always linked with the literature part of it.
So it was a 2-year program?
It was a 2-year program, yeah. And they also had a it was called sort of a junior college idea, and then they also had a preparatory school that was also 2 years. And they also had similar courses. So I'm going to give some examples from these catalogs. One of these was published pretty much every year. The seminary and then National Park College was in existence, and it gave lists of faculty, the upcoming calendar for the year, the courses, and then a list of students from the previous years. This is the one from 1911, and we're going to talk about faculty here a bit. Or actually, first I'll talk about the Delsarte method. So 2 teachers who were on staff in 1911 and 12 were Emma Ostrander, who did elocution and dramatic art, and Mary Townsend, who did the same, and this Delsarte thing here that pops up. And Delsarte acting method was designed by François Delzat, and it was supposed to be a way of connecting the inner emotional experience of the actor with a systemized set of gestures and movements. And so, see melodrama. Think silent films. These are the kinds of movements and actions, especially here. Appeal, this is entreaty, this is surprise, supplication, you know, those kinds of very overly dramatic movements. And the problem, kind of as people describe it, is that it's not well understood usually by the people who were teaching it at the time. So it was very popular worldwide, especially in America. And the quote I have here is, it became so popular and was taught by many teachers who did not fully understand or communicate the emotional connections behind the gestures, and as a result, the method devolved into melodramatic posing, the kind in response to which the Stanislavski method would later develop his inner psychological methods of getting into the character. So now we'll move on to faculty, because as I pointed out here, we had Emma Ostrander. She's one of the faculty I'll talk about in a moment. This is a photo from 1899, 1900, and I'm including this because it's a great photo. And it jumped, unfortunately. There we go, that's the one I wanted to start with. Showing essentially Vesta and John Cassidy. So John Cassidy at the time was the president. Charlotte Priest was one of the first teachers hired and was on staff until she died in the 20s. This woman, Annie Kaspar, was one of the voice teachers, and then Ida Abbott, Viola Butts, and were piano and voice teachers. I think it's these two. The writing on the back is difficult to figure out which is which. And I think this woman here is Maud Carruthers, who is one of the elocution and Belles Arts and dancing and dramatic art instructors. So, yes, so those were the ones. So that's the other way I was able to figure out some of this, because this woman is a chaperone, so she doesn't have an academic degree. I'm assuming that's why she is without the mortarboard. And there is a chaperone as one of these two ladies. So anyway. So faculty of music, looking over every single list of faculty for the all the years the seminary was in existence, some commonalities came out. Unlike other departments, they had both group classes and individual study for almost every student who was taking one of those courses. So unlike the mathematics course where everybody was in a group lesson and had no private instruction, these groups had group and individual study. And those consisted of private lessons, practice time supervision, special events. And this faculty of music changed more frequently than other departments. Reasons for this are likely that there was a rich environment around here of people who wanted private lessons, and so they could support themselves that way. Many of them were performers in their own right, and you can find all kinds of newspaper articles all up and down the East Coast, and I found some mentions of them in Europe as well, performing, so they probably didn't necessarily want to hang out here for more than they had to, longer than they had to. And there were plenty of other schools in the area that needed similar services. And also there is frequent appearance and disappearance, reappearance of previous music faculty. So I'm assuming that if their private lessons weren't going so well that year, they would sign up again for another year of teaching here at the seminary. And the other interesting fact is between 1 and 4 members of the Kaspar family was on staff between 1894 and 1931. Oops, this is really sensitive. Anton Kaspar and Annie Romer Kaspar, so Anton and Joseph were brothers. Anton was the younger, and Joseph was married to Annie. So Annie and Anton were the first two, and there's no faculty listing in the first catalog of the seminary, but it's likely they were here because they offered these courses in 1894. But they certainly taught in 1895 and all the way through 1928 for him, and he was the one that taught the mandolin, guitar, and banjo. Annie Romer Kaspar, soprano, taught voice here until 1923. Her husband Joseph taught violin 98 to 24 for 26 years, and then their son, Joseph and Annie's son, Henry Romer Kaspar, taught piano starting in 1915 until he retired in 1931, and then he's the only one I could find a death date for in 1941. So 34 years for Anton here on staff, which is one of the longer of the staff members. The younger one, the son, Henry Kaspar, and Lucia Hendley founded the Henley Caspar School here in Washington, a music school, which had very, I don't know exactly the methods that they used, but they were up to date, I guess, at the moment. And this is Lucia teaching some students in 1925, and there's some dolls here and some cards and lists of composers and pictures of composers and such. So, but Henry Caspar started the school at the same time he started here at the seminary, and he was musical director until shortly before he died. So he quit the seminary and continued to be musical director at the Henley Caspar School. So faculty, some interesting little facts that I came across in doing the research, just sort of random things. The most interesting of which is Emma Ostrander, who I mentioned earlier, one of the elocution and drama teachers. She was listed in 1910 through the 1922 catalogs, and then she returned for a single year to be on the administrative staff and to oversee the sororities. And that's her picture here in the center in 1931. And the interesting thing is she participated in the Women's Suffrage March allegory in 1913 as the figure Charity. And so the photo that you probably all saw when the Women's March happened in January that they published repeatedly in the Post and other newspapers about the Women's Suffrage March in 1913 included this image, which you probably have seen. And this is Columbia. This is on March 3rd, steps of the Treasury Building. They performed an allegory, kind of a sort of a tableau vivant, but not really. So it was mostly silent. There was music that accompanied it, piped over loudspeakers. And the most important figure here is Columbia, played by German actress Hedwig Reicher. And then Florence Noyes portrayed Liberty. And then it's pretty clear from the descriptions that this is Emma Ostrander here, who played Charity, and Sarah Truax played Justice. And the quote that I have from the description, hang on, whoops, is Emma Ostrander, Charity, accompanied by an arrangement of Ombra mai fu, the aria from the first act of Handel's Xerxes, in which the title character admires the shade cast by a tree. As the aria's slow, stepwise melody and steady measured bass line began, so did a solemn procession. 2 children descended the stairs, strewing rose petals, preparing Charity's path. Behind them, she floated down the broad stairs, accompanied by a group of young handmaidens clad in a diaphanous pale blue. Yet, in the episode, musical accompaniment offers more than simply an atmosphere of solemnity. For audiences familiar with the aria's text and operatic context, as Charity danced gracefully to her spot on Columbia's right, which is how I figured this must be Emma, she likely evoked and associated the suffrage activists with the same sort of tenderness, beauty, and sweetness that Xerxes ascribes to his beloved tree. So, and it's also known that women from the seminary participated in the march. There was a cavalry contingent of students from the seminary that participated in the march. Oops. So another one is Hazel Penniman Luther, who taught voice here, listed in the catalogs from 1917 to 1920, died in January 2003 at the age of 113. She, at the time, was the 9th oldest person in the world. She was the, 5th oldest in the US and the 2nd oldest in Florida. And the quote I have here is, at her 113th birthday party, Luther was asked whether she wanted to live forever. "I think I already have," she replied. And you can see here that her birthday was celebrated on December 11th, 2002, and she died basically a month later. And the next one is this rather innocuous but very grand-sounding Mrs. Gladys Van Bailey Woodrow. She taught piano and harmony, listed in the 1925 catalog only. And evidently, she wasn't really Mrs. Woodrow anymore. It was a really nasty divorce, evidently, in 1919. From the Cincinnati Enquirer, Gladys Van Bailey Woodrow is suing for divorce and alimony from Edgar Woodrow. She alleges that for 3 years he has neglected her for other women, upon whom she says he spent his money lavishly. Through her attorney, she says he drank to excess and during the racing season would attend the Latonia races every afternoon with other women. Mrs. Woodrow tied up her husband's holdings with an injunction issued by Judge Darby. So, and then the last one is rather tragic. This is Miksa Mersin, a Hungarian pianist, taught piano here for 1 year. He taught piano in '57 to a future opera star, Chrysalin Petropoulos, who performed at the Vienna State Opera. And he was murdered during a mugging in '62. And his case actually became famous because the defendants were convicted on, this should actually be not evidence, but rather a tip that was obtained during the period that someone else was in illegal detention. So it's a complicated issue, and it was written up in multiple legal journals. But anyway, he achieved a note of fame there. So performance schedules. Well, basically this is the performance part, and I'll talk about the schedules. So there's this schedule, which is the external events that happened here at the seminary. So these are things that the girls attended elsewhere, not here on the seminary grounds. In 1910-11, there were 44 musical events that they could attend, 28 drama events. In 23-24, there were 46, etc. So 72 in 1910, 63 in 1923-24, and 57 in 38-39. So these were just evening events, and they could sign up for and attend. And they were all with people that were like, oh my God, they actually were real people who lived. Some of the actors and actresses who you would read about in these lists. For NBS events themselves, the faculty always had recitals, usually at the beginning of the year because the students hadn't prepared their own performance things for the year. So there would be a few recitals at the beginning of every year, somewhere between 3 to 9. And these would be their voice, instrumental, dance, so they're the faculty's strengths. And for student recitals, there were 23 various voice, instrumental, dance, and various choral groups. And in 1923-24, there were 15 plus many recitals, is all it said. It didn't say how many there were. And in terms of student plays, this was a pretty consistent number. There were 10 plays performed. So the faculty performances, here's an example of one of the flyers for that. Very grand looking typeface, very high quality paper. And this just gives you a list of essentially the faculty who are on staff and the things that they were playing at the time. And this is another important thing. I'm just going to show this once, but on the back of every single flyer that was ever produced at the seminary, they always listed the ushers. It was a big deal, evidently, to be listed as an usher for these things. And then just to give you some other examples of these recital brochures and flyers, there's the recital that Miksa Mersin on piano gave in 1931. 35 or 36. I can't read it from here. But the other interesting thing to note is the differences in size. I was amazed that very few of these programs had consistent sizes. So it wasn't as if they had their stock paper and they printed their stock recital information. I think people just picked out their own papers and picked out their own inks and whatnot for these. So, we're talking probably a lot of money to get these printed up all the time. Student dramatics. So this is the program for the play Natoma, which was performed at NPS in 1913, and this is May Little in the title role of Natoma. And it is essentially an opera. that was written by Victor Herbert, who wrote the music. And the opera was, according to Meredith Willson, when it opened in 1911. So basically 2 years after this was written, it was performed here at the seminary. And in 1911, when it was performed at the New York Metropolitan House by the Chicago Production Company, it says it was probably the biggest flop of all time. It said that the Times reported that the audience at the Philadelphia premiere evidenced positive excitement after the first act, but that after the second act, however, which it is evidently intended to be the principal feature of the opera, in which the effects are piled upon one another, the audience was curiously apathetic. And then later, it gets better, says here, in 1922, the one at the Metropolitan, the lucky few thousands who were able to beg, steal, or forge tickets to the Metropolitan on that gala night. And of course, the plans for the reception after the undoubted triumph included every kind of caviar, pheasant, and dignitary under glass that could possibly be squeezed into the banquet room at the Friars Club. The disaster became apparent early in the first act, and by the intermission, all the people who were able to attend the reception were clutching at their bosoms in agony, knowing they couldn't possibly go to this reception and that they couldn't possibly not go. The opera got worse clear down to the last curtain, which finally fell like the hopes of the customers praying for a last-minute miracle. So, with that glowing introduction to the opera, but the point here is the high production values of these things for a play that was going to be put on once or twice maybe here at the school, the number of students who were involved in all of the entire performance. There's Emma Ostrander as one of the directors. I think there was a play, The Arabian Nights, in 1912. So I think that's what this is from. There are 4 or 5 photos of this. But these others are just completely random, undescribed. I have no idea what they are, but these are relatively adventurous and well-done sets and lots of good costumes. And all very different too. And of course, this is an all-girls school, so all the male roles are being played by the female students. And here's some examples of the other brochures. This is a 1909 play called A Gypsy Girl of Hungary. They put on the Mikado in the 30s, and the senior class, 1913 was the Mikado, and also in the same year, they put on Much Ado About Nothing, the senior class did. You can't tell from these scans, but these are kind of shiny gold-looking inlays on these things. So again, tons of money spent on this.
One performance night.
Yeah, effectively, yeah, that's it. This is a list of all the characters, all the students who were in The Gypsy Girl. This is the inside of the Mikado, and again, the ushers, figure prominently here. Not as many performers. There are quite a few up here, but it doesn't look as impressive. And then here are the cast of characters for Much Ado About Nothing. So it seems like half the school was in on these things. The other thing to point out right here is it says Chipsiu, Chi Psi Epsilon, the pagoda. Many of these productions list a single sorority, and they don't actually say it, but I've gathered that what this essentially means is they're the sponsors. It's not being put on by them. These are not all members of Chi Psi U, but rather it's being sponsored by them, so they're the ones who are organizing it, probably selecting the costumes and the stage design and that sort of thing. And later on, some of them do actually say sponsored by. And then some of the other performances later on have specific songs or specific parts that are performed by members of specific sororities. So.
Did they use their own musicians for the orchestra?
Yes. From what I can tell, although I'm not sure, it's not clear because they don't list.
I didn't see them listed.
Yeah, they don't list most of them there. So it's possible that in the early days they didn't, but there are some performances in which they do list the the orchestra members, and the assumption is that they would be students in that case. Right, right. This is another brochure for a play that's not the Mikado, but rather The Girl in the Mantilla. So what that has to do with a pagoda, I don't know. But it's a really nice multi-page program for this. And again, it was put on by the same sorority. And again, when it says by, I think it really means sponsored by.
Did you say they occupy the pagoda? That sorority?
That sorority occupied the pagoda, but this was, of course, all put on in the Odeon, which I think it says the Odeon. It was all performed there. And it flips up, and so everything reads down this way. So as you go through, and I didn't show the last page, but on this one, on the very, very last page, it lists all the sororities, and it says songs performed by, and it lists all the various sororities. So now I'll talk about a couple of students in specific. They're both from the class of 1924. This is Mildred Clisby. She was Hamlet, so the photo on the advertisement for this talk is her sitting dressed as Hamlet. Again, it's a cast of thousands here for Hamlet. And, all kinds of relatively minor roles also have their names listed. And there she is as Hamlet, looking great. It's a nice big photo, so you can clear. It's not not a bad photo. It's a very, very well done, well made photo. And then here's some scenes from Hamlet. This was all in the 1924 catalog listing, and this is Mildred Clisby as Hamlet. This is a nice sword fight, and then this is not quite sure what this is, but anyway, it's also part of Hamlet. There were another, and I already mentioned this, but I put this in to remind myself to make sure I did mention it, and that is a lot of these plays that were put on by the seminary were put on very shortly after they were written. They either got rave reviews in London or rave reviews in New York, and so the girls wanted to put them on, and they were given, and they bought the rights and got the rights to actually produce these plays here at the seminary. So this is A.A. Milne of Winnie the Pooh fame, and this was performed in 24, and the play was written in 22. So the other student is Alita Esch from class of 24, and she went by Alita. She also went by Betty. Her middle name was Elizabeth. So you see Betty and Alita back and forth. This is her graduation recital in spoken English. She performed, she wanted to be a drama performance major. And I should also point out on Mildred Clisby, she came back 2 years later and was on the faculty here for 1 year as a drama teacher. And I forgot to add that slide. And she ended up marrying a lawyer and moving to Indianapolis. And he founded the Bar Association organization in Indianapolis. And she performed in 2 other plays over her lifetime that were advertised in the newspapers there.
That's a very creative spelling of Elizabeth.
Yes, there are several of those names in the seminary records of unique spellings. And she did several readings on the program. She had one by O. Henry, and also one by Alfred Noyes, who actually came and delivered a lecture and read some of his poetry here at the seminary.
Is he of the Noyes Library?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. And this is her. I think this is after her recital, that her graduation recital. And this is, I think, it's some other event. I don't know what it is, but this is her. And this is Alita here with her roommate. What fell there? Oh, with her roommate. And this is a letter that was written on May 3rd, so the day after the recital, her spoken recital. And it's written to a Mrs. Joyce. Not clear who Mrs. Joyce is. And it basically, hang on. says that Alita gave such an unusually beautiful recital last night that I can't resist the impulse to write and tell you about it. And then it goes on for 5 more pages, just gushing over how wonderful this was. So all I can surmise is that this is May 3rd. Alita's a dramatic arts major. And then at the end of May, oops, I clicked the wrong one. This is the end. It's written by Zola Bauman, who's was the dramatic arts teacher at the time here on campus. And in May 23rd of the same year, so basically almost 3 weeks later, they put on Smilin' Through, romantic comedy in 3 acts, and Alita was the star of the performance. So I can imagine that maybe she was trying to suck up to this woman to get her to come down and see Alita in this, to give Alita a leg up on her acting career. So again, a cast of thousands. Here's Alita. Unlike the actual play, the actress who plays this role is also supposed to play this role. And the actor, or actress in this case, who plays this one is supposed to play this one. But they obviously, spread out the wealth to as many people as they can in there. And the story, it was a play that was written performed in 1919 for the first time. There is a popular song that was written at the same time by Arthur Penn, and it kind of goes along the same lines and tells kind of the same story, and it became so popular that the producers of the play convinced the author, who's Jane Cowell, to rewrite her play to incorporate the music into the play. So when it was first performed, it already had this song that kind of grafted onto it. The first performance was in 1919, and this was performed in 1924, so 5 years later on the seminary campus. And it's the story of, it sounds juicy, a young Irish woman in love with an American, Kenneth Wayne. The romance, however, is opposed by her father, John Carteret, who recalls the painful memory of his tragically thwarted love for Kathleen's aunt, Mooneen, who was murdered by Kenneth Wayne's father, of all people. So, she actually had the play in her effects that she gave to the seminary, and this is the one that came from the playwrights. She's got a bunch of stuff written in it. These are the original actors who played the role in New York. Stage design, location of various components of the set, and then her role, marked out for her. So I'm going to get ready, Steve. You can get ready, and I will play. And this is a scene from the stage performance. So this was so popular that in 1922, so 2 years before this production, they filmed it as a silent film with Norma Talmadge. And then in 1932, they filmed it again with Norma Shearer. And then in 1941, they filmed it a third time with Jeanette MacDonald in the title role. And so here it is. I'll just play a 2-minute excerpt from it of Jeanette MacDonald saying, oops. No, here, I'll do it. So that was either 2 minutes that lasted 30, or it was not enough. But anyway, so now I'll just show you a few of these playbills. And remember, there were about 10 productions a year. So this is the Pomander Walk, it was called. It was popular, I think in 1911, 1913. Sorry, 1923 this performance was, and the play was popular in 1911, first performed. And it was so popular that there's an apartment complex in Manhattan that's now named Pomander Walk. So, but again, this is almost life-size, this thing. It's huge, and it's full color. It's quite impressive. Some other brochures, 3 plays, the Senior Dramatic Arts Club, the French students, the German students, and the Spanish and Italian students all had their own productions that they put on, so there was always at least a one-act play or sometimes a full-blown play in that language here. They also put on The Sorcerer in 1923, and we're all talking more or less the same year here. And again, a cast of thousands. Here is the cast photo, stage photo from The Sorcerer. It's about half the school. Merchant of Venice the year before. Also even more people here. I had this counted up. I think there's 101 people here on this one. Yeah, there are, the main cast is 32 people here, 43 people listed here, a total of 101, and the student body in 1923 was 285. So it's almost half the school is participating in these, in some of these large productions. What time do we have?
You're at 45 minutes.
45 minutes? Okay, I'll do one more briefly. Well, so I haven't even gotten to music yet, or to dance. They're not quite as interesting because they don't have the nice photos that you have in the dramatic arts one, but you've got interesting brochures and flyers and some interesting stories to tell about the various people who are involved in those. So I think I will stop here and continue the rest of it at a later date in part 2. So.